Hey, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
So we love systems here at Personality Hacker. Obviously, we talk about personality type systems all the time, right? That's probably why you ended up listening to us in the first place. And anytime we find a new system that we believe can help you as a person interface with other people and more importantly, understand more about yourself and how you can grow in your personal growth journey, we like to introduce those systems to you and have conversations around them and about them and get you included in those conversations online. That's why we invite you to come over to our different social media channels and have those conversations. And today we want to launch into a short series talking about men and women. We're going to tackle women first, not literally tackle them. We're going to talk about women first. That was a bad choice of words. We're going to talk about women first. And we're actually going to talk about archetypes in women. And I think this is going to be a really interesting conversation for us because as we move through the world, personality type is one thing, Myers-Briggs and Enneagram, and there are other energies at play in our lives beyond just typology. And we want to unpack some of that today. And I think it's going to be a really interesting conversation over the next series that we're starting here that I think you're going to really dig.
Yeah. It might be better to say feminine and masculine archetypes. However, that said, there's a distinction between feminine and masculine archetypes and something called the Animus and the Anima. So we're diving into something that has its roots in Carl Jung and the system. Well, this is not really a system of personality type so per se, but that's how you and I have started to adopt it because after reading the book that I'm about to introduce, it was so powerful. We just almost instantaneously started adopting it as a way of referring to different styles of feminine and masculine energies. The book that this podcast series is going to be based on, it's actually two different books. The first one is called Goddesses in Everywoman, and the second is called Gods in Every Man. And the author is Shinoda Bolen. She's a doctor and Jungian analyst. She wrote these books back in the 80s. She wrote Goddesses in Every Woman in 1983, I believe, and then Gods in Every Man in around 87, 88. I'm trying to remember exactly when, but I do know in Gods in Every Man, she makes a reference to the Iron Curtain as if it still existed. So it had to have been before 89. And as a Jungian analyst, she uses Jung's concept of archetypes, Animus, Anima, and then also certain energies present in the feminine and in the masculine. So let's define some of these terms and then talk about why her concept that we've started to adopt as almost like a typology system, why her concept is so intriguing to us and some of the elements that have been particularly powerful for me. Now, I think the reason why I fell in love with it so much is because it really validated me as a thinker woman. And I'm always on the hunt for things that help me feel more feminine. And I feel like some of the major ahas I got from her book were maybe they were sort of the final nails in the coffin of some concepts that I had been working on for a really long time. But as I mentioned, let's define some of our terms and then launch into this concept. So what is an archetype? Well, Carl Jung defined an archetype as a collectively inherited unconscious idea that is universally present in individual psyches. So effectively the collective unconscious or the unconscious mind that all of us share. And there are certain patterns or types that end up in this collective unconscious that we as individuals start to manifest. They're patterns of people types that we see showing up over and over again. They're basically images and ways of experiencing reality and ways of seeing that have and continue to exist within all of us collectively as a group, but then as individuals, we have a tendency to adopt and then identify with. So that's effectively an archetype. And in the books that Bolen wrote, she uses the pantheon of Greek goddesses and gods to describe some of these archetypes that still live on today. And so these are pure archetypes. They're images of femininity and masculinity that have survived for thousands of years. And so to look at some of these archetypes is to understand ourselves more and more. There's one more definition that's really important to understand before we launch into specific goddesses first. And that is Jung's concept of the anima and the animus. The word anima is Latin for like breath or soul or spirit or vital force.
It's a root for animation, right?
Yeah, exactly. And Jung used this word to describe the inner feminine of a man. And then the alternative word for the inner masculine of a woman is animus, which is like the rational soul or the mind or mental powers or courage or desire. And so there were certain characteristics that were considered, if a woman showed up with them, were considered to be her animus. This was the masculine side of her showing up. And the same with men having certain characteristics that appeared to be more feminine or were, sort of in traditional roles considered more feminine. And so that was his anima. That was the feminine side of him showing up. But what was nice about Bolen's take is that charting back these archetypes to Greek times, to the Greek pantheon, which is thousands of years old, indicated that in the collective unconscious of the Greeks lived characteristics and features that might have been, in traditional times considered masculine qualities, but were part or maybe even the core of some of these goddesses, indicating that these were feminine archetypes. They weren't women who were displaying an animus. These were feminine traits themselves. And they correlate, in my mind, very strongly with thinker women. So I think one of the things that has happened, and we even did a podcast a couple years ago called Thinker Women, Feeler Men. And in that podcast, we talked about some of the challenges that thinker women can have and feeler men can have when they feel like maybe they're going against some of these traditional roles. Now, traditional roles are not as much of our collective unconscious right now. In fact, we're kind of pushing against some of these traditional roles, opening things up, understanding that, some of this is socialized, or maybe quite a bit of it is socialized. And a big piece of this is that it's not quite as cut and dry as maybe we had one time thought. But that said, it also indicates that maybe some of these components that we believe are assigned to one or the other might actually have more crossover than we think. So it was a really fascinating, for me as a thinker woman, it was a really fascinating take to go, oh, hey, yeah, maybe that is a feminine archetype and not simply a masculine animus, right, inside of me. So it was a pretty cathartic read for me. And as I mentioned, I almost instantaneously sort of picked it up and shared the books with Joel and these concepts with Joel. And so we've really been talking about, is that person like this goddess or is that person like this god? And it's been very telling to help sort of fillet out some of these concepts, especially for understanding ourselves and our roles. Another piece of it is that some of these goddesses or traits of the goddesses, they almost feel like it's not just one I think we're going to talk about 7. Actually, I think that there's 7. Yeah, there are. There's 7 different goddesses that she talks about having different feminine archetypes and these different roles. And one of the concepts that I found really interesting was that there's actually just sort of one feminine, but it's been fractured. It's been fractured into multiple different styles or archetypes. And so as we go through, if you're listening, whether you're a woman and identify with more than one of these, or you're a man and some of these are your anima, right? You might even identify some of your, if you're a man, you might identify some anima in there, and that does happen as well. And then when we talk about the gods, those of you who identify as women will pick up some of your animus, right? You'll see some of these masculine archetypes that you might identify with, and there's some peppering back and forth in that element too. But you probably will and should identify yourself as a woman with more than one feminine archetype. And it's because the more archetypes we identify with, the more balanced we are, the more well-rounded we are. And some of us have a tendency to marginalize some of these archetypes and kind of resist them and push them away and over-identify with others. And it's really a matter of balance and being able to pull on these different elements at different time periods in your life. So as we go through these different styles, it's good to not just identify what you believe you are or which goddesses you identify with the most, but also figure out the ones that maybe are a bit of a shadow for you, or maybe a bit of a weak point, and ask yourself, what are some of the ways that I could develop that more in my life?
Yeah, so like we said, we're going to talk about the women first, or the female energies first, the female archetypes first, feminine archetypes, and then we're going to talk about the masculine archetypes after that. So we're going to kind of go through this series of conversation. We're going to tackle a few of them in each episode. And then what I think would be really interesting, Antonia, is when we get to the end point of the female archetypes, you could contextualize some of that, some of the learning you've taken away, some of the ahas you have as a thinker woman, for example. And as we go through the male archetype, or the masculine archetypes, I'm mixing up all my words. At the end of that, I can share some of the things that I took from it on my side, and also vice versa. But I think that'd be really interesting to hear personal stories woven into some of this and how it's impacted us, what we've gone through with this. And again, just like anytime we talk about a system, typology system, Myers-Briggs Enneagram, or this archetype system that we're going to display to you or unpack for you and with you, use this for good, not evil. Obviously, these can be used to put people in boxes and limit your viewpoints on yourself and other humans. It can feel fatalistic or oversimplified, and realize that all of these energies live inside of us, right? All of these masculine and feminine energies live inside of us. It's really which ones we're bringing to the world, to which degree are we allowing them to showcase. And some of them might be suppressed. Maybe there's a natural wiring you have that you've been suppressing for a while. And as we talk, and we're going to give our insights on how this impacted us as we talk through it too, not just wait to the end. But as we talk, you might identify these, and you might be like, man, that feels like me, but I feel like I've suppressed that in me. Just pay attention to that. And really, it's a good place to just suspend your judgment on this and just take all this information in and really ruminate on it. We think that it's going to be really helpful in our modern world, especially the time period we live in now, to understand some of these energies at play, how they show up, and it might give some reason why there's conflict between people that actually want the same thing. They're just coming at it from very different viewpoints. Different energies are at play, and they think they're at odds, but they're really not. And I think we can create some harmony and some understanding between humans by understanding more and more archetypes and typology systems and all that. So just wanted to give those comments. Today on the podcast, we're going to talk about 3 of the feminine archetypes. We're going to choose 3 of the 7 to unpack today, and we're going to go through them. Obviously, this is going to be a cursory overview. There's no way we could deep dive into all of the nuance and understanding of all of these, but we do believe that this will be good enough as a launching point for you. And we cannot recommend highly enough to go get these books. We'll have a link in the show notes where you can go pick up these 2 books, Goddesses in Every Woman and Gods in Every Man. And we believe that they are very powerful books to read for your life.
Right. So as mentioned, in Bolen's concept, there was originally 1 feminine, and then it got fractured into 7 different archetypes. And these archetypes show up at different time periods in our lives. They can be, triggered by different hormonal changes. Some of the archetypes become present when, say, a woman becomes pregnant. Some of them change with menopause, and some of them change just based on circumstances. And then, of course, we have a natural proclivity or trend toward one or more of these archetypes. And so the way that Bolen sort of organizes this concept is in 3 different styles of goddess. The first style is what she calls the virgin goddesses. And that's actually something she picked up from the Greeks. These 3 goddesses were designated virgin goddesses by the Greeks. The second style of goddess she calls the vulnerable goddesses, and that's her assignation. And the virgin goddesses were characterized by their own independence, by belonging to no one, by basically something that came from within them as a drive. But the vulnerable goddesses are more relational goddesses. They're more defined by their desire to be in relationship with others. And so therefore they're vulnerable because they're more dependent upon relationships with people that they can't control. And then the third style of goddess is called the alchemical goddess. And she is alchemical because she was neither a virgin nor was she vulnerable. She was the one goddess that got to choose who she was in relationship with, got to choose her lovers, got to choose her path, and at the same time was never victimized. She was the one that basically was a little bit more in charge of her relationships. And so Bolen calls her the alchemical goddess.
If I was a woman listening already, I would be like, that's the goddess I want to be.
Yeah.
Like that would be instantly the one I would want to, that's just my personal viewpoint. Like I'd be like, okay, what is that goddess? Because that's the one I want to be. She's not victimized. She's independent. She gets to choose. That's it. That's the holy grail of goddesses, right?
Right. Well, but there's also elements to that particular goddess, which we'll eventually get to, that has some positive and negative characteristics like they all do. The first three virgin goddesses, which are the ones that we'll talk about in this particular podcast, are Artemis, Athena, and Hestia. And then in the vulnerable goddess podcast, we'll talk about the three vulnerable goddesses, which are Hera, Demeter, and Persephone. And then finally, we'll end with Aphrodite, the alchemical goddess. And I personally, when I read the books, I personally identified with more than one goddess. There was a couple different goddesses that I was like, oh, I can totally see myself in that one. Oh, yeah, I can totally see myself in that one. And then in other ones, I was like, yeah, that's not me at all. Not at all. But then I also recognized the need to visit or maybe develop some of those goddess traits. But we're going to start with the virgin goddesses. And the virgin goddess archetype is basically, I don't even want to just say an independent woman, but she's not driven. None of these goddess archetypes are driven by need to please. Now, the way it's crafted in the book was the need to please no man. But regardless of her, her sexual desires or who she wants to be in a relationship with, she's not driven by a need to please anyone, not even herself, which is interesting. That means that whatever she's driven by is almost like a light inside of her, something that she has to obey, something that even if it goes against her own personal desires, she still is compelled to obey this light. And so for each of the virgin goddesses, there is a sharp focus. There's sort of there's a characteristic of a targeted approach, something that they specifically are driven to act upon or get done or have an experience around. And so the virgin goddesses are fascinating in the sense that, and if you are identifying yourself with one of these, is that it's almost like the guiding star is whatever is true for you, whatever is like true deep down to the marrow of your bones. And it will be kind of different with each woman. Now, what's great about archetypes is that you can actually break from the pattern of descriptions of these archetypes and still be a part of the pattern, because it's almost like we identify with or adopt elements of these archetypes, but we vary, because there's so many ways that it can express itself, we vary with the detail without losing that basic pattern. So as you listen for these, you might not be exactly as described, but if you kind of understand sort of the gestalt of the goddess and identify with that, then that's the part of you that's evidencing is that particular archetype.
I love bringing German into our podcast with Gestalt. But a couple points to make here. So no one's going to be one of these energies, right? So if you're a feminine energied person, you're going to have multiples of these probably at play. You probably will have one or two you favor, maybe a few you favor. So they're going to be seasoned with other characteristics. So no one's going to be a pure Artemis, for example, or a pure Athena. Some people might have higher levels of that than others, but no one's going to be one pure form of any of these goddesses. You're going to have a lot of other archetype modifiers that play into this, right?
Just as sort of again, talking about the key qualities or characteristics of the virgin goddesses is that for all three of them, they're sharply focused on whatever it is that's driving them. They have kind of a one-track mind. And so it allows women who really identify, or those who really identify with this feminine energy, whether it's an anima for you or whether it's your core feminine, archetype as a woman, whatever you focus your mind on, that's your task at hand. And it might not even be achievement oriented, interestingly enough. It might be simply that you get something spiritual from it. It might not be necessarily that you have an outcome that you're trying to create, but rather you lose yourself to these things.
So again, the three goddesses we're going to talk about today are the virgin goddesses: Artemis, the goddess of the hunt; Athena, the goddess of wisdom or warfare; and Hestia, the goddess of the hearth. So let's talk about Artemis first.
So Artemis was the daughter of Zeus and Leto and the twin sister of Apollo. She was a very celebrated goddess, and she left civilization. She forsook cities and dwelt in the woods with nymphs. And she actually forsook relationships as well. She was marked by qualities like competitiveness, independence. She was the protector of wildlife and of young girls. She actually helped with childbirth, but also was the goddess of virginity. And she was very earthy. She was marked with a bow and arrow, and she was called, or it was known that she had unerring aim. She didn't really like to be around people very much unless they were her companions, her nymph companions. And she was very environmentally focused. She was also the goddess of wild, undomesticated animals and a protector of them as well, even though she was also goddess of the hunt. And she only fell in love with one person. She fell in love with Orion. But interestingly enough, it was her competitive nature that killed him. She was, again, the twin sister of Apollo, who is also a celebrated god. And her one love, Orion, had swam out into the ocean. And Apollo, who was jealous of Artemis's attention to Orion, he gave her a challenge that she couldn't hit a spot out into the ocean. And she took his challenge, and without even questioning what that spot was, she knocked what's the word? Knocked her bow and arrow? Or
I think
bow?
that's it.
Knocked her bow and her arrow and let it loose, and it hit Orion dead on the head, and he was dead from getting hit on the head. So Artemis's competitive nature kicked in to a point where she killed the only man that she ever loved. So it's very interesting to see the Artemis archetype, that this concept of competitiveness, this single-mindedness, this ability to be targeted, to have high degrees of competence, and to not be easy to not be easy prey to relationships, to not fall for infatuations or loves. That's all part of this Artemis archetype.
One of the things that might be helpful here is to think in terms of either people we know or popular characters in movies or television. And there's two characters that come to mind that really, I believe, embody this Artemis archetype. And the first one is the character of Katniss in the Hunger Games, right? Literally, she's in the woods running around shooting bows and arrows when we meet her in the first Hunger Games movie. And she basically is on her own. She doesn't like to be around people very much. She is very independently spirited. She's highly competent. And she has this protective streak. You know, in the movie, if you haven't seen it, spoiler warning, but in the movie when her sister's getting ready to get called to the Hunger Games, this is a protector of young girls, Artemis character of Katniss that steps up and says, "I'll go instead. Please don't send my sister. I'll be the one to go and compete in the Hunger Games." Another character is from Game of Thrones. The youngest Stark child, Arya, is a very Artemis character. She's, again, she's not in a relationship. She's independent. She lives in the wilderness often in the show, and she's training to be a swordsman or a swordswoman, and gets to be a very competent fighter. And if you follow the storyline of Arya, you see a very Artemis-styled archetype show up in her. And she wants to protect, and she wants to get vengeance, and she has a determination in her that is very strong. So I think those are two characters we can see from popular media, just to get an idea of what this archetype might look like when it shows up in an actual woman that's displaying this.
Yeah, she was also called the far distant Artemis, and so she was marked by separation, and that includes emotional separation. So while there's a lot of benefit to being Artemis, not having to necessarily try to please others, not to have to try to please society, there's also sort of an emotional distance that she keeps from other people. And that can bring on an almost a cruel quality sometimes, or a merciless quality at times. There's a story that she and Apollo overheard a fellow goddess, Niobe. I think she was bragging about the beauty of her children to Leto and saying, well, you might have, Apollo and Artemis, but I have 6 daughters and 6 sons, and they're all beautiful as well. And so Niobe was bragging, and Apollo and Artemis went and killed all of her children, all 12 of her children, to punish her for bragging to Leto, because they made Leto feel bad. That's a very cruel and merciless, thing to do. Even in a time period where death was not considered that big of a deal, it was a very vindictive act, because they made somebody not feel good. And so she robbed them. Artemis helped rob Niobe of her children. And so Artemis, the dark side of Artemis, the positive side, is that independent streak, that competitiveness, that ability to stay on target and on focus, and the competence that comes along with Artemis. But one of the dark sides of Artemis is that emotional distance that allows her to be cruel or to be unkind. So one of the growth paths for Artemis is to create more less emotional distance, more of a closeness. There's an awareness and an importance of love is incredibly important to Artemis. Also, the passing of time is very important, because there's a sense that Artemis can get caught up in the present moment. There's a sense that she can get sort of lost in her activities and not really build for the future, because she's so in the moment.
She's a tactician, basically. She's really present in the moment and very tactical.
Exactly. And so being able to see in longer timelines, being able to have more strategy under her belt is also really important. And then there's also an importance to have some creativity. Because she was a virgin goddess that pushed others away and wasn't really, like she was marked by separation, there's sort of a correlation between production or procreation and creation. There's a sense that Artemis wasn't particularly creative because she wasn't really creating anything. She was just being independent, and she was helping others, right? She was the goddess that helped child labor, but it was more about making sure that the women who were in labor didn't suffer unduly. But as far as herself, she didn't really produce much. And so there's an element of creativity that Artemis might be sort of not tapped into. And so developing goddess characteristics that allow them to be more creative is a path of growth. And later on, we'll talk about like a Persephone who has a deep imagination, and we'll talk about Aphrodite, who has a natural understanding of love and awareness. So if you're a strong Artemis character, then those are the goddesses that you might be interested in developing more of. We were talking about being kind of in an Artemis time period. Do you remember that conversation?
Yeah. I think it is a very Artemis time period. It's marked right now in our current climate as very independent for women and the feminine energies that are coming. And it looks like the Artemis archetype is very celebrated, a strong independence, and rightly so. I think that for a long period of time, and we get to the other archetypes of women, you're going to see in these goddesses that there's a lot of vulnerabilities and other things that can be exploited. And it's the Artemis energy that's standing up and saying, look, we're not going to allow women and the feminine energy to be exploited. We're going to stand for ourselves and stand united as sisters. I see this happening all over, and we're going to make sure that we put a stake in the ground and say, this isn't going to happen anymore, right? I think this is definitely a time period that we're in. And I think that the challenge is that just because this is a time period doesn't mean every feminine energy is wired to have this as the natural, like if you're a strong Artemis energy, for example, not all feminine energies are going to show up like you necessarily. So we all have to understand that not everybody's going to come to the table with this, but the world does need more of this right now at our time period, right?
Yeah. Artemis is very tapped into also, like she's not just independent, but she's also tapped into what's fair. And so the idea of wanting to protect young girls and wanting to protect women from cruel or unfair treatment means that a lot of people who are really tapped into feminist movements have a very strong Artemis energy. Artemis was marked by hanging out with other women. And so Artemis women stick together. And so that idea that all of us independently come together as a strong force, right? And so an Artemis woman might have separated herself from the norms of society, but that actually makes her stronger when she's fighting against the injustices of society. But at the same time, again, the important thing for Artemis energy to remember is the importance of compassion and love. And these movements, these feminist movements and the movements towards making sure that women are protected and less exploited, the important thing of remembering long-term strategy in that and remembering the importance of compassion and love, those are things that make those movements even more powerful.
Yeah, it's my opinion, again, just my opinion, that the more Artemis energy can look at principle-based solutions, like long-term principle-based solutions that are not just tactical, in the moment, I think the more sustainability that energy will be able to have and the bigger impact on a longer timeline that energy will be able to have. So if the Artemis energy goes for the short-term win, just to, feel like if there's an opportunity, for example, for the Artemis energy to get a short-term win, that might feel really good. And it might feel like the Artemis energy won something that's really, really significant. But again, if it's tactical, it's not attached to principle-based change for the long term, that actually might do more harm than good sometimes, right? Because there might be a backlash to it. So again, take the principle of what I'm saying. This is, again, my opinion, but I believe that Artemis energy channeled to strategic thinking, systemic thinking, and thoughtful thinking with compassion, like you mentioned, Antonia. Man, can you imagine the types of changes that could be made for women in our world and the feminine energies that show up? I believe that's the right way to go about it.
Yeah. Compassion can be strong too.
So let's talk about Athena.
You want to talk about Athena? It's talking about strategy. Let's move on to Athena.
Do you have the birth story of Athena? Because I think it's a fantastic story.
I do. So Athena sprang from Zeus's head as a fully grown woman, which is very Athena of her. Zeus had this terrible headache, a splitting headache, if you will. And then he asked Hephaestus, the god of the forge, to hit him in the head with an axe. So Hephaestus hit him in the head with an axe, and out emerged Athena, fully grown. And so Athena was a fascinating character because she wasn't just goddess of wisdom. That was her primary characteristic. She was also goddess of crafts, and she was the goddess of wartime strategy, which is very interesting for a lot of thinker women who identify with Athena energy to see military strategy as part of a feminine archetype. She was the only goddess to be shown in mail, like as in plate. I don't know if it was plate mail, but it was definitely in armor. And so her armor was accommodating to her body. It wasn't male armor that she pushed herself into, but it was male armor that, showed the shape of her body because it was designed for her, because she was in it all the time, and she held a spear. She was the goddess who presided over battle strategy in wartime, but also over crafts and domestic arts during peacetime. So she wasn't just a war hawk. She was also someone who was around during peacetime. And she was a protector of cities. She was the goddess of weavers and goldsmiths and potters and dressmakers, and she's credited with giving humanity the bridle to tame the horse. So she taught people how to basically domesticate big animals in order to help them with agriculture. So she was a very industrious woman. And when I think of this archetype, I think of women who have a strategic, industrious mind. They're women who are fantastic at getting things done, marking things off with the checkbox, right? Like they're never, they're just high producers and strategists that create a lot of industriousness.
Now, this archetype is marked a little bit different than Artemis in that Artemis really separates out, the feminine separates out away from society, away from the masculine, hangs out with other women. Let's distill this down to like embodied in a woman, for example. Whereas the Athena archetype, it doesn't really separate out. In fact, it almost identifies with the masculine energies more. So if it's embodied in a woman, for example, as Athena, it tends to over-sympathize or over-identify with the masculine, right? Either a masculine energy in itself it's not exactly that, but it's also can go to, I'll put this in air quotes, go to bat, quote unquote, for men, for example, right? So some like conservative pundits, for example, that are women often are this archetype, or and I'm sure some liberal pundits too, depending on which side of the aisle. There's all sorts of these. Somebody character like a Hillary Clinton might be an Athena energy, a lot of Athena energy coming from someone like a Hillary Clinton, right? A get it done attitude, strong in strategy, tends to run cover for people that may not be behaving well, like her husband, for example, because she's really identifying with him in a lot of ways, and the man in her life or whatever, the men in her life in that way. I think a popular character that might be identified here would be Claire Underwood in the show House of Cards. Seems like a very Athena-styled woman, a very Athena energy embodied in a woman character.
Yeah, absolutely. Athena, when she was pictured, was always pictured standing next to a man. So she was pictured standing next to Zeus, or she was, pictured standing next to Achilles during like the Iliad, where the Trojan War was very prominently featured her basically helping in military strategy and getting really involved and helping like Achilles, who was the hero, until all of a sudden he wasn't. And so Athena energy has that almost like kind of tough thinker, strategist energy, but like you mentioned, identifies more with men than maybe an Artemis energy. Artemis is very much identified with other women. Artemis only wanted to hang out with other women to speak of, whereas Athena more hangs out with other men. So these are like C-level executive women who have just fought their way to the top. I think of like the Margaret Thatchers, the
Absolutely.
First female prime minister.
Or who's the president of Germany right now? What's her name? Angela Merkel.
Yeah, Angela Merkel is a great example of an Athena. Now, what's interesting is that while Athenas can be for women's rights, like a Hillary Clinton, she talks a lot about, glass ceilings for women and busting through. What's interesting is that Athena women, as you mentioned, can sometimes be weirdly protective of the masculine energy. And so sometimes they and Artemises go to bat against each other because Athenas will protect what they think is almost like the right of men who have worked hard to get into positions that they're in. And so Athenas, even though they are, they can be extraordinary allies for women, they can also kind of weirdly throw their fellow sisters under a bus.
Yeah.
And that's because as quote unquote military strategists, there's a deep simpatico with men who are some of the only people that they really kind of feel like understand them, because they don't necessarily feel understood by other feminine archetypes. That said, when they are people who go to bat for fellow women, they're tough strategists there too. They can be, really powerful, basically voices that help women get to the next level, because they're the ones who show, don't tell, right? They're the ones who have fought their way to the top and become C-level executives and run nonprofits, or, become the Claire Underwoods. So they can be really powerful voices in that direction too. So we're not trying to say that Athenas are always, throwing fellow women under a bus. But one of the most impressive thing or powerful components, not impressive, I don't think it's impressive, it's more of like an aha, it's an insight, is after I read the Athena chapter, I went, Athena is a feminine archetype. Athena is not an Animus. Athena was a feminine goddess in the collective unconscious of the Greeks a couple thousand years ago. So what's so fascinating about Athena is that she is clearly a strong thinker character, and she's fully feminine. And so regardless of whether Athena is like whatever they end up doing with their life, right? Whether or not they end up, going into business, or they go into politics, or they just run their house incredibly efficiently, whatever it is that they're doing, they are doing it in a feminine way. And I felt like that was a very powerful statement, that women who have a tendency to kind of identify with men in this way, they are identifying with men not because they're masculine, but because they aren't necessarily tapped into some of the other more traditionally feminine archetypes. And so I found Athena to be a very cathartic chapter for me when I was reading the book. I went, yeah, that's right. Now, I don't actually identify myself as much of an Athena at all. I'm way more tactical. I'm probably more on the Artemis side than the Athena side. And at the same time, it was really refreshing to read that Athena was not a masculine animus. Athena was a feminine archetype.
Yeah, I think both Artemis and Athena, first of all, are energies that we're seeing come about right now in the time period of history. I don't think it's just Artemis. I think there's a lot of this Athena energy coming up right now from my observation as a man watching women embody these two archetypes. And you're right. I think there's sometimes, sadly, there's sometimes a warring between these two energies when I think they can sometimes work together in more harmony than we tend to see. I think that oftentimes they can be embattled. And what's also interesting to me, again, observing these energies at play, both of these energies feel very much accessible to thinker women. So I think thinker women have more, again, looking at the goddess archetypes, I believe thinker women have more access to the Artemis energy and the Athena energy than maybe feeler women or other women. Like I think it shows up more, right? I think in the thinker woman's experience often. Mm-hmm. And so if you're a thinker woman listening, you might be identifying with one or both of these archetypes saying, wow, that really does describe a lot of how I see the world from my viewpoint. And it's not just maybe because, I mean, it probably is partly to do with that you're a thinker woman, but also it might be part of it is the archetype that you're embodying in more than the other archetypes that we're going to talk about throughout this entire series. It just might be that both of those things are at play for you. So I noticed that a lot of thinker women tend to be very Artemis heavy or Athena heavy. And that's a pattern I've observed. I don't believe it's a one-to-one correlation between personality type and these archetypes we're talking about, but it is something I've just observed in the wild, if you will, from my personal experience.
Yeah, and I would argue that Artemis is a more tactical goddess, is going to be, I think thinker perceiver women who use the cognitive function of introverted thinking will probably identify more with Artemis, and then TJ women in the Myers-Briggs system, like women who use extroverted thinking as their cognitive function, will probably identify more with Athena. And at the same time, even feeler women who also have thinking cognitive functions in their stack or in their car model may also identify with these elements of these goddesses because of their access to the thinking elements of themselves as well.
Yeah.
Just to touch on the growth points of Athena before we move on. So there's a couple things that Athenas can do to become more, more self-aware, because they have a tendency, Athena archetype women have a tendency to go with what works and to be very industrious and be more business oriented, even if they're not actually in like a corporate setting. They're all business. The two elements that Athena can really tap into to be a more fulfilled person is, first of all, recovering her childhood. So Athena she didn't have a childhood. She just sprang out of Zeus's head as a fully grown woman. And Athena women can sometimes feel that way. Like sometimes I've heard them say things like, well, I raised my mother, or I was the mother in the household, or I started taking over, sort of the household chores from very young, or I organized everything. And so Athenas may not feel like they ever really got their childhood. And so going back to, sort of figure out that childlike wonder, the part of them that doesn't have to feel responsible for everything, the part of them that can sort of relax and not feel like everything's on their shoulders all the time. When there is an opportunity to sort of listen to other people's stories and think about things that they haven't personally experienced, and to be able to be with their feelings as they hear other people's stories. And so if an Athena woman also happens to be a woman who uses, say, extroverted thinking, this would be more going to her childlike place of introverted feeling, that listening and the sympathy and being able to understand other people's experiences. These are all sometimes lost to Athena women because they feel like they have to produce, they have to be industrious. And they lose that ability to sort of like lean back and listen and just sort of tap into a more sympathetic place that reminds them of their own more vulnerable childhood, their own sympathy to themselves. And then, then they can maybe discover a place of emotion and, being able to get a good cry or to be hugged or to maybe just play and laugh and be playful. Those are all paths of growth for Athena. The other element is discovering her mother. Athenas need to discover their mother because Athena never had a mother, not that she knew of. And so being able to be sympathetic to your mother as an Athena. Again, sometimes Athena archetyped women will say, I raised my mom. And there's almost like a marginalization of their mothers. There's this sense that mom needed me, I didn't need her. And I don't really understand what she was good for. I mean, that can be sometimes the narrative or story between
and
Athenas.
Over-identification with dad or brothers too, right?
Exactly. And so being able to tap into what the mother energy does for her, and to be able to create a connection between that, to be able to rediscover the relationship to her mother. Now, Athena's actual mother was named Metis, but she didn't really kind of understand that because of the weirdness of her birth. And so being able to appreciate as opposed to depreciate the mother figure and go and find her. Even if your mom is still around, right? Even if you talk to her every day, going and finding your mother's energy and her beauty and the things that make her lovely. And the reasons why maybe not being as Athena as you is a perfectly acceptable path. Finding her archetype. That's a path of growth for Athenas because then they can sort of... Athenas have a tendency to not really forgive themselves very well. They push themselves really hard. And again, just like not having a childhood, not having a mother figure to lean into, sometimes feels like they always have to be tough all the time. So being able to find that more vulnerable place and not feel like you have to be tough constantly, but also can be youthful and emotional and not constantly industrious, but be gentle. Those are all paths of growth for Athenas.
So should we move on to the third archetype we're going to talk about today?
The third and final Virgin archetype. So the final one is a very interesting character. She is the only goddess that didn't have a face. She wasn't personified by any sort of art or sculpture. She was only personified as a hearth. Her name was Hestia, and she was goddess of the hearth. She was part of the original 12 Olympians. She would have been Zeus's sister. And so she, unlike Artemis and Athena, she was not Zeus's daughter. She would have been one of his sisters. And she wasn't really, I think at one point she was removed from that 12 and she was replaced by Dionysus. And she didn't really make a fuss about that because Hestia doesn't really make a fuss. Hestia is the least known of the goddesses. And one of the reasons why is because she's not really known through stories. There's no real stories about what Hestia did or her engagement. There was a couple little mentions here and there, like Aphrodite tried to seduce her into falling in love, and she never would. And then another time, Aphrodite seduced somebody else into falling in love with Hestia, but it never really took off. And so Hestia wasn't really known through stories and through actions and activities. She was mostly known as being a warming energy in people's houses. When a married couple, right after their ceremony, their house was consecrated by the mother of the bride taking some of the fire from the hearth of the parents' home and carrying it in front of the couple to the couple's home. And in that way, she carried Hestia energy to sort of consecrate or warm the house of the couple. When children were first born at the age of about 5 days, the child would be walked around the hearth of the house in the middle of the house. And that was its introduction into the family. It was its welcome into the family to be walked around the hearth of Hestia. So Hestia was more of an energy than a person. And what's so fascinating about this is that women who have the Hestia archetype have a tendency to be warm. That's sort of their qualification, is that they're warm and inviting, and they turn their homes into warm and inviting places, but they don't necessarily themselves have a very strong personality. They more turn their homes into a temple than it is anything else.
It seems like, from my perspective, that this energy is very much a provider energy, a support energy, an enabler energy. So it enables people to have a good experience when they're in the hearth space, right? This Hestia energy that creates this hearth, this warmth, this container space for good times to be had or for positive experiences to be had. And someone has to create all the nuance and detail in the background, stoke the fire, keep it burning, metaphorically speaking, and just maintain all the things in a household setting for people to enjoy themselves. Someone's got to be attending to all of that. And that's that Hestia energy that you're talking about.
Yeah, and what's interesting about Hestias is that when they're doing that, they don't feel like they're being marginalized. In fact, they turn like housekeeping into almost a meditation. It's very pleasurable for them to be doing these tasks. They don't just have to be housekeepers. Many Hestias become nuns, or they commit themselves to other institutions where they do work that maybe other people, they have a tendency themselves to demean. But the Hestia doesn't demean it. It turns into almost like they turn it into this sort of unhurried, peaceful activity. They get really absorbed in each task. It's called participating in time, and it's very psychologically nourishing to the Hestia. So what's interesting is that when you saw like second wave feminism, there was this big push to remind the Artemises, right, and even the Athenas that would have been part of that second wave of feminist movement, to make sure that there was enough space to acknowledge that some women just kind of want to keep house, that that's something that they want to do, that it's pleasurable for them, and that the most important thing was the ability to choose. And so Hestia women have, they tend to do activities that might not be well celebrated amongst other women, right? Like I personally am not much of a Hestia, so I don't find my home to be a temple, and I don't find housework to be a meditation. And yet at the same time, I know that I can call upon that when I'm like doing dishes and I feel the warm water flowing over my hands and I get really absorbed in the task and maybe my mind wanders and I'm really in the moment. And that's my Hestia coming out. It feels like a very inwardly turned function or way of experiencing things. And so when a Hestia woman isn't just working in the house, maybe she has a career. Hestia-like activities would be things like photography, something that doesn't require anything to be hurried, something that really requires somebody who can observe and see the flow of life and capture a moment and sort of engage with things in an almost spiritual way, as opposed to a more aggressive or takeover or dominant way.
As we talk about Hestia, it's hard to find examples of a character in a movie or TV show because Hestia is marked by not having a persona, not having a face, not having this strong personality that you can look to and say, oh, that's a Hestia quality. It's more of it, like you said, like it's more of an energy that shows up. And so we were thinking in terms of what would be one of the good examples that we could think of. And the best one we came up with at this point, I was originally going to say Martha Stewart, right? I was going to really just say that because she's all about creating the hearth space in a home and helping people do that. But I think Martha Stewart has a lot of Athena energy in her, right? She spent some time in a federal prison for insider trading. So she's got some like drivenness and some like really, really like aggressiveness to her to be able to do what she's done and build the empire she's done. But there is a little bit of Hestia coming out in her in at least the crafting and the way she illustrates how you can do things around the home and create that hearth space. But I think a better example of Hestia, and this is a counterintuitive example, but if you look at the movie The Matrix, when Neo goes to visit the Oracle, the woman he visits, the Oracle to get wisdom from her, the Oracle literally in the Matrix changes shape and takes on different personas depending on what is appropriate for the context. But when he meets her, and the first time he meets her, she is baking cookies. She's tending the hearth, if you will, and she's providing and creating a container of warmth and comfort for Neo and the experience that's there. And she's got a very calm, centered energy. And she's not a very bombastic or outstanding character in the movie, but she is an energy there that you can see that Hestia energy showing up in her. I think that's a really good example to look at for getting a sense of what this might look like in a person that has this quality.
Yeah, I love the Oracle as a Hestia because She didn't really involve herself too much in the politics of what was going on. And when she gave Neo what she imagined was bad news, she wasn't too bothered by it herself. Like, it wasn't like, yeah, okay, now it's going to really ruffle my feathers to give you bad news. It was like, well, that's the news I have for you, so be on your way. And so this idea of being so inwardly focused and not losing the warmth, I think, is also a very Hestia quality. I think a couple other characters that, because like you said, it's kind of hard to find Hestias in popular culture because they don't make those strong, bombastic personalities. They're more in the background. They're more supportive roles, and they're easy to take for granted. That's one of the biggest challenges with Hestia. But another two characters that kind of came up for me was in the show True Blood, the grandma who was in the first season made me think of a Hestia. And then also I was kind of wondering if Luna Lovegood in Harry Potter was like a burgeoning Hestia, very inwardly turned, almost sort of tapped into something spiritual that nobody else could see. And really kind of, like when people didn't really understand her, or sort of marginalized her, she didn't really bother her very much. She was just sort of in her own world. And that was a very Hestia quality. And she was using her Hestia energy with magic, not necessarily with homemaking or hearthkeeping, but specifically with magic. But that was her own sort of spiritual practice. And she was tapped into something that other people were like, okay, that's weird. And Hestias can be a little quirky and weird, because they're so inwardly focused.
Yeah, I think to that point, Hestia energy is quiet, and you can almost see it being overrun by some of the stronger feminine archetype energies to where it gets marginalized. And I've been thinking about, in our time period when there's a lot of strong feminine energies coming out right now, and rightly so, it's a time period for that. Hestia gets kind of not necessarily pushed to the side, but just it's not necessarily accommodated all the time to being brought with all those strong energies, right? And I think we're seeing a little bit of not a backlash, but definitely an appeal to that energy, that Hestia energy that's quieter. I think of the book, The Life-Changing Magic of Tidying Up, right? This book that's become wildly popular in the last few years, a New York Times bestseller, because this idea of tidying up your home or creating that hearth space and having a place for everything and having a love for the things you have in your life, right? And that's a very Hestia-styled book to get back to that hearth space in our lives. And I think you can see certain books like that coming out and being very popular because women or feminine energies that crave that Hestia example are looking for markers that they can latch onto for the archetype.
Yeah, and to be devalued is very hurtful to Hestias. They already have a tendency to marginalize themselves and sort of go into the background. They feel like non-persons sometimes because they contrast themselves with these really powerful, in-your-face Wonder Woman style archetypes. Wonder Woman, that was another example of, I think everybody in that area was kind of a bit of an Athena and an Artemis at the same time. That was like a really powerful example of those two strong feminine archetypes coming out. And Hestias kind of look at themselves and they go, I must be like a non-entity in comparison. But they're not. They're very valuable feminine energy that gives women an ability to turn inward and really find something within themselves that's meditative and special and pure and beautiful. That energy that can be brought out to the world and really provide comfort and good spaces to other people. So we're in a time period right now that might be not really tapped into the importance of that Hestia energy. And so those women might feel a little devalued, that's not a good thing. The other thing is that we used to be in a time period of institutions where a woman could enter an institution like marriage, and that was for life. Or maybe, get hired on with a company, and the companies were more, the companies and workers, neither one really have that long-term relationship like they used to. And so they're not really institutions you can attach to, a company or a marriage or maybe even a convent. We're in a time period of a lot of flow and energy flow and more temporary arrangements in the modern world. Things are really fast moving and more temporary. And so it's hard for Hestias to have anything to hold on to have a ballast. And that can feel very unsettling to them, to not really feel like they have something that that they can really kind of make their own and turn into their own personal temple. So it's kind of a bit of a rough time period for Hestias right now. But if you identify as a listener, if you identify with the Hestia energy, then know that this is a valid feminine archetype. Just like sometimes Athenas feel like they're not valid feminine archetypes, or Artemises don't feel like valid feminine archetypes. Sometimes we can get these messages that we're not okay, but this is part of the pantheon, right? This is one of the 7 archetypes of femininity that are very valued and valuable. So even though it might be a bit of a rough time for you right now, know that you have a place. You have a place in the pantheon. There are a couple things you can do, though, to develop yourself. And one of them is by acquiring an assertiveness that comes along with the Artemis or Athena energy, or even with your Animus.
You're talking about for Hestia specifically.
For the Hestias, developing that Artemis or Athena energy is how you get that ability to fight for yourself. Because Hestias might feel like they don't really have that ability. And Artemis and Athenas absolutely have the ability to fight for themselves. So kind of going inside those archetypes and figuring out activities that will encourage you to develop those portions of yourself. But also, Bolen recommends considering developing what's called your Hermes Animus. Hermes and Hestia were very frequently sort of seen together. Hestia was the hearth in the center of the house, and then Hermes was a herm in the front, or a pillar in the front of the house. And those two represented sort of an inward-facing and an outward-facing ability to engage. And Hermes was the god of travelers and business and engagement. And we'll talk about that in the Gods in Every Man podcast. But there's a way for a Hestia to develop the Hermes Animus that gives her sort of a front-facing piece where she can be more assertive and have a way to engage with the world that feels less non-identity, nondescript. Hermes is actually a very fun god to develop. And when we get there, my recommendation is if you're a Hestia that needs a little bit of assertiveness, not only go into Athena and Artemis, but also pay attention to the Hermes part of the Gods in Every Man podcast.
So we're looking at these 3 archetypes, and we'll talk about the next 3 in the next podcast, which are really interesting because we're going to get into the vulnerable goddesses, those archetypes and those energies that show up. So we've just covered the virgin goddesses, Artemis, Athena, and Hestia. And we'll cover all the rest, but just understand that if you identify with one of these, one of our temptations as humans, and we're going to talk about this in every aspect of this, whether it's goddess or god, for men or women, or masculine or feminine, if you identify with one of these strongly, it's my belief that we tend to overvalue our own experience. And we say, well, I'm an Artemis woman. I mean, I don't say it to myself. If you're a woman that identifies with the Artemis archetype, for example, you might say, well, I'm an Artemis woman, and that's how women should be. That's how feminine energy should be, because that's how I see the world. Or I'm an Athena, or I'm a Hestia. It's very easy for us, and we'll probably see this in every single podcast that we do this series. It's very easy for us to over-identify with that and say, this is the archetype that I believe is the most important because it's the one I resonate with the most. It's the one that I think every woman or every man should have, depending on how you see it, right? And this is a danger because I think the power in understanding these archetypes is not to say, oh, I'm this energy and I think everybody else should be this energy too. It's to say, oh, no wonder I have the way I see the world. And no wonder this person over here, this other woman over here maybe sees the world in the way they see it. They're using a totally different archetype, or they're showing up with all these other archetypes over here strongly in their personality or their embodiment of energy. Well, no wonder we have the differences in how we see things. Of course, that's how we're going to do it. I think that's the power in this, is to being able to see just how much we identify with something and how probably you've been going through your life, if you identify with one of these 3 strongly, going, what's wrong with all the other people around me? If you're a woman and you're embodied in that feminine energy of one of these 3 and somebody else doesn't have it, you might look at them and go, they need to be a real woman and embody this XYZ characteristics, right? And that's the temptation with any typology system or any archetypical system, that we tend to overvalue our own experience and then project that outward. So I just want to bring attention to that as you resonate with one of these, because I'm sure as you're listening, you might be resonating with one of these things we said. Realize that it's not the full picture. And you have all of these archetypes in you. If you're a woman that identifies with these feminine energies, you're going to have all these feminine energies. You have access to all of them. It's about which ones in which period of time in your life and which ones are more represented. It's which stage of life you're in, which other energies are around you that contrast against it. And this is, I think, really the power in this particular system that we're talking about today.
Yeah. If you didn't identify with any 3 of these archetypes, then your archetype is probably coming up next. We're going to talk about the 3 vulnerable goddesses, and they are more defined by their relationships with other people. So hang tight if you didn't really spot yourself. That said, if you didn't see yourself in Artemis, Athena, or in Hestia, my recommendation is to figure out ways where maybe you can fit some of these archetypes into your life. Are there ways that you can develop some of these? Can you develop a tactical approach or a more strategic approach? Or can you develop something that has a sort of an inwardly, spiritually turned element? That might be good for you to develop some of these 3 if none of them really resonated with you much. But after we talk about the 3 vulnerable goddesses, you might identify yourself in one of those 3, and then it's good to sort of pair them up with certain other archetypes that are very helpful. If you're an Artemis, make peace with the Athena and the Hestias. If you're an Athena, make peace with the Artemises and the Hestias. And if you're a Hestia, make peace with your Artemis and Athena self. And then we'll move on to the next ones. And my recommendation too is that if you strongly identified with one of those 3, also pay very close attention to the vulnerable goddesses, because there's probably an archetype in there that you could stand to develop. And that might be the thing that helps really round out your relationships and round out your personality. So kind of think of these almost like cognitive functions in our function stack or in our car model. We're going to have ones that we favor the most, and then it's usually something else that we don't naturally favor is usually the thing that we got to start really working on in order to be a complete person. So all of these, if you are a woman, all of these feminine archetypes are very helpful to hear about. And if you're a man that develops your anima, one of these goddess archetypes is probably your anima. So identifying that, or which there might be more than one that's your anima, the one feminine aspect of yourself that you really need to integrate. And the challenge with that piece is that oftentimes we have a tendency to deny our anima or our animus. If you're a man listening, you probably are in some way denying your feminine anima. And when we get to the gods in every man, if you're a woman, you might be denying your masculine animus. That's very common. So being able to hear it and identify it and then integrate it is a very powerful element. So those are just some recommendations on how you can experience these podcasts as we go through them.
Yeah, and I would also say that if you're a man listening and there are women in your life that have these different archetypes, this is interesting to pay attention to, because you can understand the women in your life much better from realizing the different energies at play, right? Understanding this about the goddesses in every woman and going through this book with Antonia helps me understand more about Antonia as my wife, my lover, my partner in life. I have much more nuance of understanding. I understand her personality type, and now I understand more about the energy she's bringing, the energy she's trying to develop, the energies that are natural to her, and the energies that she wants to cultivate more of. And I think as a man, it's really powerful, especially, again, for the women in your life, whether they're your sisters, your wives, your mother, whoever. These are or girlfriends or just friends, just the friends in your life or coworkers. It's just interesting to see these energies at play, and it gets you a much more understanding of the feminine around you. So I think it can be really powerful for us men to see this and get a much richer understanding of how women are showing up to the world.
And help honor it, really.
Yeah, and help honor and support it and be there and understand which energies I'm talking to at any given time. When I'm talking to an individual woman, I can see the energy that's coming through, and then I can help make space for that and honor it and provide for, on my side of the equation, provide for the great dynamic there that can be.
Which one do you think is your anima?
I don't know. I have no idea. I have to think about that. I haven't thought about that yet. I need to think about that.
All right.
Maybe on the next podcast, I'll talk about it.
Maybe you'll have an answer by the next one.
I'll have to think about this tonight.
I've been thinking about my animus a lot. So when we go into the Gods in Every Man series, I'll talk about my animus.
I bet you my anima is Aphrodite. We haven't gotten there yet, but I bet you that's where it sits.
Yeah, you think so?
I mean, that's my first gut instinct. I have no idea, but that's probably where it comes from.
Which is the one you like the least, and that's probably the one that's yours because you're denying it.
Oh, yeah? Is that true?
I don't know. Maybe. Who knows?
Power wave from around it? I don't know. So we've done a lot of talking here, but it's time to stop and let you have a voice. Right now, head over to personalityhacker.com, directly below this podcast. Leave a comment, ask a question, add to the discussion, or share your story. I love stories. Stories are great because they help us understand each other in profound ways. Which one of these energies do you identify with? Do you not identify with any of these energies? Are you a man that identifies with some of these energies? Are you a woman that identifies with some of these energies? Do you not identify with man or woman and you identify with some of these energies? What is it for you? Unique to you. You're going to have your story, your unique perspective. There's 7 billion of us on the planet. There's 7 billion individual stories. What is yours? Come over to personalityhacker.com, give us your story, and help us understand this together, and we can get a discussion going among like minds. And speaking of like minds, don't forget to head over to facebook.com/personalityhacker. or twitter.com/personalityhack. We're also on Instagram and YouTube and various different LinkedIn. We're on different social media platforms. Whatever your preference of platform is, please come and join us there. And we're growing communities of like minds, members and groups of people that think very similar to you. And we are all interested in growing ourselves as people, becoming better versions of ourselves tomorrow than we were yesterday. That's really the goal of what we're all about here at Personality Hacker, finding ways to hack into our personalities and grow ourselves. So go do that now, and we will see you online when you come and make a comment at personalityhacker.com.
And if you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. And if you would like to support Personality Hacker, the best way to do that is to look at our premium content and see if there is a personal development program that's right for you. You can invest in yourself and you can support us so we can keep doing these podcasts forever.
I don't know if we're going to do them forever because I imagine we're going to die someday.
Well, into the indefinite future.
Okay, fair enough. My name is Joel Markwitt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we'll talk with you on the next Personality Hacker podcast, where we talk about the vulnerable goddesses. See you then.